Welcome back. We're fixing to get started on some more wiring goodness on the 65. If you hear a buzz in the background and see a little something way out up over there, the wife's out screwing around with her car. Don't worry about that. That's not what this video is about. Anyway, we'll check in with her later and give you a teaser of what's going on there. But what I'm actually going to be working on today is solving an alternator problem. So I'll show you what the problem is, and then we'll talk about what the plan is to fix it. So the alternator bracket, blah, 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 can't speak this morning. It's still kind of early. I guess I haven't had enough coffee. The alternator bracket that I have in here right now anyways is this low mount bracket. And it's designed for an alternator that uses 180 degree mount points. And I have used this in a slightly janky way on a stock front end. It made it work. I was planning on using it again on this front end, but I've run into a problem. As you can, I don't know how well you can see it, but the hole for belt tensioning is right here, more than halfway out on the slot. And the alternator is hitting the steering rack underneath. So that's not gonna work. That's not enough. I might be able to find just the right belt that'll put it right there at that end where it won't sit on the rack, but it would be very tedious to find a belt that's just right. So this bracket as it is not going to work. And you're probably thinking, well, why don't we just get a water pump mount one? That puts the alternators up in this region, which for most people works fine, but I think alternators are generally ugly and they have wiring, which I like to hide. Hence why I try and tuck them down low where they're further down and out of sight. Typically on a Chevy too, if it was an all stock setup, the alternator bracket actually comes off the exhaust manifold and has an arm that'll come off the intake to the intake or the water pump. I can't remember if it's for the V8s, but it comes off and it holds the alternator up over here and up high, and I don't want that. So, and a lot of the aftermarket kits that come off the water pump do the same thing. They hold the alternator up here, up high. They're also way out to the side in order to get the body of the alternator to clear the valve cover and the head. So you have to run a long belt, which gets a little bit of belt whip, and when you're running V-belts, it makes it easier to kick the belts off. So yeah, we're gonna do something a little bit different. Okay, so I got horribly distracted and forgot exactly where I left off telling you about the alternator bracket, other than we've got to change it. So like I said, that alternator bracket, which by the way, the best I can find is the cheapest short water pump bracket you can get, or cheapest kit for mounting an alternator for short water pump application on the market anywhere. It's also on Amazon, so take that with a grain of salt. It has worked for me, and we're going to modify it because modifying that to get my end result is cheaper than any of the other kits that also put the alternator where I don't want it. That said, one of the other things that I am going to change at the same time, which yeah, I'm kind of going back and forth, is I'm going to switch to this alternator, which yeah, it looks pretty cruddy, but it does work. The reason I'm going to switch is because this doesn't use the 180 mounting points. This uses like the 10 and 2 60 degree mounting point, maybe something, no, more than 60, 120 degree. It's probably 120 degree, which is going to change how I can position the alternator and secure it in place. I have an idea of how I'm going to get there with modifying this bracket, but it's going to be kind of hard for me to film it and do it at the same time. So I will, I'll get you some pieces of it, how I modify this bracket and switch to this alternator. One of the other major changes with going this route, which I don't see the plug on that one, the alternator that I'm taking out is a 2-plug alternator. Oh. There you go. No, well, it's a plug kind of like that, but a 2-pin for an alternator. It's probably on the engine bay harness that's in the back of the car. This alternator that I'm putting in, even though it looks very old and crusty, is much newer, and it's a 4-pin alternator. It's a newer design. The There's a downside. That means I got to figure out, man, the camera's looking at a weird angle. My bad, guys. The downside to going to the 4-pin is it does mean I have to do some modification to how this gets wired in, which I don't know if I will address in this video or if that'll be in the next video. Try and get to it in this video if I can get the bracket modified fast enough. But it's worth doing that modification because the older 2-pin style stock alternator for this application, you can get them in high output, but they're real pricey. Otherwise, the stock style, which aren't exactly cheap anymore these days either, they're about a 60 amp output alternator, whereas this is an OEM alternator as well, but it's 105 amp output. So we're gonna get a much higher performance out of the alternator by changing to that, and we don't actually have to add any wires to the harness. It's just how you wire up that 4-pin into the 2-pin harness to make it work. Anyway, like I said, we'll get into the wiring a little bit later after I actually get it mounted, because you can't permanently run or ideally run wires if you don't know where they have to go and terminate. So let me get started. I'm going to modify, well, I'm going to show you the plan. I'm going to make some changes on how this is hanging in here, see if it'll work the way I want it to, and then we'll move on to actually modifying and bolting the alternator in to stay. Yeah, that's the plan. So you figured out how to turn the camera on, I see.
Shut your mouth.
So I was successful in my alternator bracket, and I'm trying to pull it up so I can show you exactly what I got and how it worked out for me. Here we go. So the first thing is the bracket kit, which sadly I have 2 of because I was a dip and ordered one not realizing I had one already. But that's this kit right here, which is what was bolted in the car, and there'll be links to all this stuff in the description down below, as well as, you know, the photo that's right there. But that's the kit, 22 bucks. This is the cheapest alternator mount bracket that I can find anywhere for a short water pump. And this is what it comes like, right? But like I showed you, as is, it did not work for my application, and I anticipate that it won't work for a lot of applications for the same problems. It puts the alternator too low. What I did to make it work, I'm taking out the brand new one to show you. I'll end up using it anyway. I took this little L that goes on the backside when you build this in, when you put this in the car, like we saw earlier. I'll just put a photo of the configuration that was in there. So I took the little L that goes on the backside, and I laid it over the top of the arm like this, and I marked it up here and hacked the arm off. Now it no longer holds the one end of the bracket, right? So then to fix that, I'll go back in here. You got another link popping up, or another picture popping up right up here somewhere. I ordered up one of these guys. This is an adjustable turnbuckle for an alternator, and it's 15 bucks, which means we are now at $36, I think, if I saw that right. But this has a 20% off coupon, so don't forget that. And I used that. So let's go on over here to the car, because I already hung this in here, and I flipped those L the other way around from how they were before. So now instead of the arms coming off the top with the hook low, the hook would have been up here on the high side where I cut it off right there. That's mounted in right here, and then I used the adjustable turnbuckle off a water pump bolt to the top here. This is why I switched to the 120 degree alternator instead of a 180, because this stud would have been out here further, which may or may not have worked. You know what, I'll try that to find out. I'll switch the alternator for you. But now with this in here, I can take the turnbuckle and spin it out to adjust the position of my alternator. And as you can see, this turnbuckle gets about 2 inches longer, I believe is what it's rated for. And that pushes the alternator out, and I'm no longer hitting my steering rack down low, I'm not hitting the frame over here where these wires are hanging down, and I have adjustment to firmly mount my alternator. And then once you get it where you want it, you just cinch the jam nut in and it'll stay. So I think that's going to work really well. Unfortunately, I don't have any belts right now that are an appropriate length. The only belts I have are just a little too short even for this, all the way tightened up, which is fine. I have a lot more adjustment range now and where my alternator can be, which is going to give me a little bit more flexibility on finding bolts. I will say this much though about this alternator extension bracket. Let me pull it off here real quick. The cheap Amazon one, is got one minor flaw when using it with a typical GM alternator. The GM alternators use a 3/8 bolt for the bottom where the main pivot's at, but the top bolt, or the opposite bolt, what might be the bottom in your application, whatever the case, uses a much smaller bolt. It uses, in this case, being a newer alternator, this is actually like a 10 mil or something, or an 8 mil bolt, I think. And this is for a 3/8, which means there's bolt slot. So the fix for that is to replace this heim joint with a heim joint for a 5/16, because this is basically a 5/16 diameter. So you replace this heim joint with one that's for a 5/16 diameter, and then that problem itself is also solved. So this is gets the alternator tucked down low where I want it. It's a clean, simple setup, and all in, that other heim joint, Speedway was the best I could find on that. It was $7. So between the cheapo bracket that you gotta cut at $22, the heim joint setup, heim joint turnbuckle setup was $15, so that's $37. Add the replacement heim joint, we're at $44 for a nice low mount alternator setup, which in the end is still cheaper than any of the name brand alternator setups. You can probably find a China version of the aluminum setups off the water pump that put the alternator up high for a similar price, but then you got to deal with the alternator being up high, which for a lot of people they don't care. But me, like I said, I want my alternator tucked down low, so it makes it easier to run the wires and hide them down low, out of sight. So when you're looking at the top of the engine, it's just a nice clean engine, not a mess of wires, which right now it's a mess of wires because that's what we're doing. But yeah, so that should work out well. We'll go ahead and switch the alternator real quick. That'll only take a second. We'll put the other one in here and see if it'll work with the other configuration. But it's, I don't know, figuring out how to have it nice and clean and not have the flimsy long arm bracket. For a completely stock setup, those are fine, I guess. I just don't think they look very good. So we're not gonna go that route. Get that guy out of the way.
Well, you gotta grab the baby?
No. Grab the, they don't know nothing about the baby alternator. It's not even for this car. So actually, you know what? We might try it though. I have another alternator. We're gonna try that one too. Let me get it out and bring it over. Find out. It should work without an issue because it's so much smaller. We'll get to that. So we'll start with the stock style old GM alternator. We'll slip it in and we'll just loosely pin it in place. Come on. Alright, and then now you would need a longer turnbuckle because this is not going to have enough adjustment. If I bring it out an inch, then I'm only going to have another 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of adjustment to push it out. So this setup, these turnbuckles do come in different lengths, but let's see, what's the swing? It would probably work if you got the longer version of this turnbuckle. I'll put a link for that one in the description as well. There's a version of this that I think is 2 inches longer, then it would probably work with this. I'm not going to order one to find out, but just looking at that, that's about 1 3/4. Puts it there, and that would give it a good bit of adjustment. So you could probably make it work with that, with the 180-degree mounts, and it would be in a similar position.
All right, pull the cute one out.
Yep, and we'll pull this one out. This alternator is actually for that car because this guy weighs a lot
Look
less.
how tiny that is.
Yeah, which, I mean, you can tell in my hand how much smaller it is, but this is basically, these two are basically exactly the same. This is I think this is a 120 amp alternator, and you can see how much smaller it actually is. Lot smaller unit. But one thing I already see a difference in is this one will require some shims or a spacer, because this section here is where it pivots in the bracket, and you can see this is a much wider section than it is right here. That's no big deal. You can just make a spacer for that or fill it with washers. That'll also give you some flexibility in shimming it forward and backwards. But what did I do with my bolt? I lost the pivot bolt. Oh no, I didn't. It's right here. Found it. But this guy will go in right here, pivot right there, and then turnbuckle
Look at
come
that.
down. And on this one, it would actually go to the front and grab the bolts. Oh goodness, I may have to put this in this car. Look how nice and tight that fits.
I told you you should have put this one in there.
Look how good that fits.
Look at that.
I might even, since that's closer to the block, the belts that I have might even fit that.
Oh snap.
But it's a nicer unit anyway. Oh, look at that.
Oh, look at that.
And then you just adjust the turnbuckle. Oh, I think that
It was meant to be.
nope, this turnbuckle's too short. It doesn't pivot out far enough. That's about all the adjustment you get out of the turnbuckle, right about there. That belt's a little too short, but I think I've got one shorter belt. Let's find out. Make sure this belt here is shorter, maybe too short. Get that out of the way. Oh, this belt's a lot shorter. Tighten that all the way back up. Yeah, nope,
Oh,
this
that's way too short.
This belt's way too short. So, probably save that one for the race car, which is what it was bought for.
Oh.
But as you can see, this setup is very flexible, pretty inexpensive. Like I said, this is about 45 bucks is what it'll be into it once I replace this Heim joint right here, and it'll give me a much overall cleaner setup in the engine bay for my alternator. It'll allow me to run my alternator wires down low. I'll probably end up running along right along this bar, just out of sight down the inner fender, and then jump from the frame across to the alternator, and that should keep it nice and clean. So that's where we're at with the alternator. Like I said, the one that's going to end up in here is going to be this guy. The pulley does need to be changed. This pulley is actually for the race car because it's a black pulley, which all the pulleys on the race car are black, so that's where it's going to go. I'll end up pulling the chrome one off of this alternator to match the chrome pulleys in this car, and we'll be good to move on with the next thing on this. I have one other part that needs to be installed because it impacts wiring, but it's a super simple thing. That's just the wiper motor. I realized the other day that I was missing that, and I got to make sure I account for that in my wiring. It'll go in right there. I got to find the Ziploc baggie with the bolts for it and make sure that I can run the 2 wires needed to operate that in with the rest of my wiring harness. Hey, look at that, it stays all by itself, no bolts needed. And then I can actually start getting wiring tightened up and routed and sheathed and loomed, etc. into this engine bay. So that's your alternator bracket situation. If you're looking for a way to nice and neat and cleanly put your alternator somewhere, that might be a good option for you. And in theory, you know what? I've got one other thing to try. Oh no, it won't work. Huh. Well, if you're running an electric fuel pump, come around this way. I'll move out of the way. If you're running an electric fuel pump, the two holes that are right here on the front of the Chevy block are exactly the same spacing as the two holes on that side I'm using for the alternator bracket. So you could take those two L-shaped arms and flip them around over here onto this side and put the alternator right here if you're running an electric fuel pump. If you're running a mechanical fuel pump, that won't work because it occupies the same space. So if you're running an electric fuel pump, this will work on either side of the motor. So another option for you, because this has got, you can get angled kickouts for that. The water hose is enough at the right angle. It should be able to come off of that, the water pickup for the pump. So that's another option for you if you really wanted to try and get your alternator on the other side. This would work for that, for tucking it nice and down low. This helps keep belt angles good, because if you look at the belt angle here, it's a nice angle that gives you about 50% wrap on this pulley. Not quite, but it gives you a good wrap on this pulley. You have a nice angle into your crank pulley, and you have a nice angle coming off your water pump to have good belt engagement, which helps reduce belt slap. It's shorter belts than if you use a high mount alternator, which helps reduce the kicking a belt off at higher RPM. Lots of good potential, low cost option. All the links for doing this are down below, and that's going to do it. You know what the plan is. That's enough for this video. We'll go ahead and put this out there. All the information you need on these parts is down below in the description if you wanted to get these parts, all the links to do it. If you want to run them or screw around with doing something like this yourself, check that stuff out. And until next time, go screw with your junk. I'm going to move on to the next thing, which is shocker, wiring.